Hello, everybody. We're going to have an interesting stream today. Lucky to have Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Lohr, who's currently employed in law enforcement and still willing to talk about some of the issues of today. So, really glad to have him on and very grateful for that. Don't forget, if you want to support my work, one of the best ways to do that is to check out my sponsors. One of my favorite sponsors, as you know, is AllisonWinePromo.com. You get 50% off of my favorite Malbecs from Argentina and 50% off shipping. These are high altitude Malbecs. In fact, they are extreme altitude Malbecs. I always say, if you're not an extremist, you haven't been labeled an extremist yet, time to move out of your grandma's basement and do something with your life. Come on. What are you up to? So check out the Rogue Malbec here on the left. It's the one with the blue label. It's from 6,000 feet, hand harvested, extremely limited production. The one in the middle is never before imported 92-point Malbec. Come on, from almost 9,000 feet, 8,200 feet, twice the elevation that we ski at. And so, the grapes got to work really hard under the sun at those temperatures. And so the wine itself has a very unique flavor. Also, the Gaucho Malbec, very good, named after the Cowboys of Argentina. So there we go. Those are my wines. Another way to support my work is coffee, which is twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. I do not have that pulled up, but don't forget, you can always go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, get a hot cup of coffee, high altitude from Nicaragua, and also support my work. They are also USDA certified organic. Okay, so let's go to our guest. I do want to warn everybody that the producer has walked into the studio. I was hoping that wouldn't happen until a little later in the stream, but hi, Lieutenant Colonel Lohr. How's it going? We do have a 2-year-old in studio.
Well, I'm glad the producer's here. Good morning. I believe our time difference is about 2 hours, but thank you for having me on. I look forward to talking to whoever has questions, to you, and this is a topic, obviously, that's near and dear to my heart. So I look forward to the conversation today.
Okay, I am going to show everybody this article. Here you are on the picture here. In Ferguson, officer friendly tries to ease tension on both sides. And this is you, called Officer Friendly. Take us back in time. This article is from 2015. What happened here? How did you become known as Officer Friendly?
Okay, so obviously, for those of you that are aware of what's happened in American law enforcement, 2014, the events in Ferguson, Missouri, which I work as a commissioned police officer here in St. Louis County, which Ferguson is one of the incorporated areas within our jurisdiction. That specific article relates to the kind of the responsibilities that the St. Louis County Police Department had during the events that took place in Ferguson. So my role at the time as a lieutenant was basically to kind of run the police side, the enforcement side of things in front of the Ferguson Police Department. I was a relatively young lieutenant, and so being a young lieutenant, I got assigned to the midnight shift or the night shift in Ferguson. So I spent essentially the majority of my time dealing with the protests, protesters, activists, and then obviously coordinating the law enforcement response to that. And so I was very fortunate in the sense that my role, again, was pretty consistent. We spent almost every night in Ferguson, Missouri, at which time I got to know a lot of the people involved. So the people that would come out to express their opinions, the people that had very, very passionate feelings about American law enforcement and the response, and kind of, so some of the societal issues were there. And my job was to basically try to enforce the law and at the same time allow people to express their constitutional rights. So their First Amendment right to come out and protest the government. And I took that very, very seriously, along with all of the men and women, within St. Louis County, and I would argue most of the men and women in law enforcement in general. We swear an oath, upon getting commissioned to uphold the laws of the Constitution and then also whatever state you're in. And most of us take that very, very seriously. That was my job, essentially, was to make sure that we could allow people to come out, express their opinions, express their displeasure, and do it in a peaceful, respectful manner, and at the same time kind of balance the law enforcement response to that, which a lot of people had issues with. And so, again, very, very fortunate. I'll be straight with your audience. I lost a lot of street credibility because everybody called me officer friendly. but the reality is it was a balance. It was a balance between, making sure that people could express their opinions, making sure that we were dealing with the criminal element that was there, because there was a criminal element that participated in some of those protests. And so to protect property, to protect life, and at the same time allow people to express their constitutional rights, that's essentially what my role was. I was singled out. But I'll be the first one to admit I was not the only person doing this. I just happened to be the one that they took a picture of and got the nickname. So hopefully that gives you a little context of what my role was.
Mm-hmm. So, as we see in the picture, you're just wearing what you're wearing now. You're not wearing riot gear. And let's talk a little bit more about that. Often we hear the militarization of the police. I hear that a lot. Now, I've heard different perspectives on that. On one hand, I've heard people say that people in the military get far more training than law enforcement when it comes to dealing with some of these situations. And from at least a training standpoint, when it comes to lethal use of force and other, I guess, interactions with the community, maybe that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I think when people are talking about militarization, maybe what they're talking about is the look of, the tanks, the big shields, the helmets and shin guards and all that stuff, and just the way it looks, like with the big batons and everything. What was happening behind the scenes when you were saying, I'm not going to wear that? What was the discussion from like your higher ups or the people you are over about that, the militarization of the police and that gear that you chose not to wear?
Okay, great question. So if you kind of take a step back, American law enforcement really had not been exposed to a civil disturbance of this size. So it had probably been 20 years. If you think back, if you kind of look back historically, the last time we had major civil disturbances, major civil unrest was probably the, riots in Watts. But it had been a long time. And so what you had was kind of a generation of law enforcement that have been exposed to it in the academy. I remember, being taught in the academy, civil disturbance, and kind of what the response was, but it had never really come into practice. And so, this was the first time in again, probably 20 years, at least in my career, that we'd seen a large civil unrest, sustained civil unrest. Yeah, you see kind of pop-up events where things go sideways for a night or two nights, but this was a sustained event. So the optics of it, certainly, again, if you go back 20 years, we didn't have social media or to the extent that we have today. So while 20 years ago, officers had helmets and had shields and had batons and riot sticks and that type of equipment, you didn't have quite the exposure that we do nowadays. And I think this was the first time kind of in our generation, if you want to call it that, where now the nation can see the law enforcement's response. And now at the same time, we're essentially kind of relearning how to do this. And I think we were a little bit caught off guard, if you want to call it that, which was just the kind of the perception or the way the public viewed our response to it. And so it was a learning process, which was understanding kind of societal's view of what it is we're doing and then trying to adjust to that. Now, and let me be clear about this, because obviously officers have a right to be protected as well. So the men and women that are going to go stand on a line have a right to be protected. So asking, or allowing an officer to wear a helmet or allowing them to wear protective shin guards, just as much as a citizen has a right to protect themselves, officers do so as well. And I understand we're held to a higher standard. I understand that that's an expectation of the job, but putting people in equipment, and I guess that was probably the disconnect, which was, it didn't seem like a big deal. Again, if we're going to go out, at 11 o'clock, at 12 o'clock at night and deal with a crowd that's throwing objects, allowing officers to protect themselves, to me, it isn't unreasonable. As a matter of fact, it's almost an expectation of our officers, is that as command staff, as supervisors, that we allow them to do that. And at the same time, balance kind of the societal view of what that looks like when we do it. And there's a bit of a struggle there. And you still see that today, which is is kind of making sure that we're protecting our officers, making sure that we're not coming across as too militaristic. We're not trying to occupy territory. We're not abroad. This isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Iraq. That's not the job of American law enforcement, to occupy. It is our job to protect and serve. And so the way that we go about and do that is very, very scrutinized, is very, very focused. And we're definitely much more in touch, I think, law enforcement in general. And I hate generalized statements. I don't like big, kind of overarching, because again, everybody kind of does it differently. There's 18,000 different police agencies within the United States. And everybody kind of does it a little bit differently, which is one of the complaints. You hear people talk about that, the consistency of training, the consistency of application. But to answer your question specifically, like, why did I choose to go about the business? Why did I choose to do that? I felt like it was easier for people to talk to me if I was just wearing a regular uniform. Now, I was comfortable doing that. That's my personal opinion. That was my personal approach to it, which was, I'm okay. I realized that I had officers behind me that were ready and willing and able to come out and protect me. And again, but at the same time, I never felt like my job was to occupy or to dictate to people. And again, so I kind of talked about that in my opening, which was, we have to balance this. So we have to balance our approach to the way that we handle civil disturbance. And so for me, I was very comfortable wearing a uniform. I felt like I was more relatable. I felt like I was more approachable in that sense. So I wasn't coming out with carrying a shield. And again, at the end of the day, I wanted people to talk. I wanted people to be able to talk to me. And I wanted to be able to at least listen. Again, I realized that, I jokingly say, there's very little that we're going to solve at 11:30 at night or at midnight or at 1 in the morning. That typically we can argue about some political topic. We can argue about kind of a conceptual thought process of American law enforcement. At the end of that, at 1 in the morning, we're probably not going to solve that problem. But again, to me, it's relationships. It's small victories. So it's the ability to at least communicate. So it's just the ability to have that conversation. And I felt like I could have that conversation if I was in just a traditional uniform, as opposed to wearing all of the gear that would potentially come with it.
I want to ask you in a second about how the press shapes the context in which these events are happening, the protests or the riots, and then the confrontations with police, and like what you're talking about, how all of that gets shaped by what people see on or read in the news. Because one might say, well, if some of the outrage is perhaps not always, but in some cases is based on lacking facts or skewed facts, why go out and try to have a conversation over stuff that people are getting wrong anyway, because they don't quite understand exactly what happened because they're getting false information from the media. That's one question I have, especially since that's kind of our topic for today. But since you were talking about, if we're on this vein of like, I wanted people to be able to talk to me and it was just me and my idea. The LA Times article says that you were also asking other officers, hey, if you want to join me, join me. And there was one interesting kind of, I think, criticism I wanted to throw your way and just see what you'd say. This is over at AllisonMorrow.locals.com. So if you want to join my editorial board, go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com, $5 a month. And you get to put in questions ahead of time for interviews, some of the most censored people on the internet. So consider joining us over there. So John Lewis was saying if he asked his guys not to wear protective gear simply to present an image, then he has everything wrong with modern law enforcement. I remember being told not to wear black gloves, the most common color, because it intimidated the black community. Perhaps ask him about sacrificing the safety of his officers just so he can get awards. So a little ouch early in the morning. Well, for you, it's a little later, but yeah, since you were bringing that up, do you mind responding to that comment?
No, not at all. Not at all. And that again, that's probably one of those areas where the media got it wrong. I never asked anyone to do what I was doing. As a matter of fact, our civil disturbance response units, they train as a group, and uniformity is a big component of that. So I never had never asked anyone not to wear equipment. I never said, hey, don't wear your helmets. Now I did ask officers to have again, what we implemented as we started to learn was more of essentially a tiered response. So think of it this way. If you've got 40 people outside of a police department that are protesting and they're holding signs and they're chanting, or again, they're expressing their opinion, that doesn't necessarily elicit a response of riot gear. And as you heard by the protesters, they'd say, why are you in riot gear? There is no riot here. And so the tiered response essentially is just that, which is if there is nothing going on other than people expressing their opinions, then we can come out in a more of a relaxed posture. So we don't have to come out hard and fast. Now, at the same time, and what, again, hopefully most law enforcement agencies have realized and have started to implement, is that you have again, that measured response. So the first time somebody in that crowd throws something, so the minute that a rock is thrown or a bottle or fireworks get launched, because that's a new tactic now that you see kind of across the country, then you switch that out, which is now I'm going to take all of those more relaxed officers and I'm going to pull them back. I don't expect them to stand out there in a skirmish line or stand outside unprotected. And so there was never a, hey, you need to come out in your, you need to come out and not wear your protective equipment. I guess that's probably a misinterpretation. That article is a misrepresentation of what the ask was.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, I understand where, I guess that was John Lewis. I understand where he would say that and to kind of put the record straight, this is not about sacrificing officers or officer safety to get an award. This is about having a measured response, an appropriate response to the crowd. And again, so if you learn kind of civil disturbance tactics, if you go to classes and you kind of study it, again, it's everything is essentially is a reaction. So the crowd starts to escalate, then you in response, you tend to escalate. The minute the crowd starts to de-escalate, so they stop throwing things, again, everything kind of that energy starts to bleed off, then our response should be to bleed off our energy as well. And let's be honest, the energy goes up on both sides. So protesters' energy is elevated, officers' energy then becomes elevated too. So this is human behavior, which is, if you have an agitated crowd and they're yelling and screaming and they're throwing objects and you bring out officers in a full riot gear, anticipate a response. That's not going to de-escalate your crowd. And maybe that was a misnomer. And 20 years ago, 25 years ago, which is we'll intimidate the public into good behavior. And wow, maybe that's worked historically. It certainly hasn't worked for us. And so everything is essentially it's a mirroring of the crowd, if you want to call it that. So that's probably the best answer I can give you, which is by no means would I encourage any law enforcement supervisor, any command level law enforcement officer to sacrifice the safety of their officers. All I would ask is that they take an appropriate response to the behavior of the crowd. So it's essentially, again, the best analogy I can say is you got 50 people outside of a building protesting and they're yelling things that typically that we don't like to hear. The police are, it's police brutality or that police are racist, and we don't like that. That doesn't elicit a response of tear gas. While we may not like what they're saying, that the response to that is not a tear gas event. Now, they start flipping over cars and they start breaking into businesses, and you have a criminal element that's maybe involved in that. Now we have an obligation to protect property. We have an obligation to protect lives and to ensure the safety of the community. And so that may elicit a different response, but it should be targeted toward criminal behavior, not toward those people that are expressing their First Amendment rights. And that is the difficult part about crowd control. That is the difficult thing to do in a civil unrest period, which is really target those people that are committing acts of crime, the criminals that are in the crowd versus those that are out there exercising their constitutional rights. And that is very, very difficult to do, especially, again, it's all scalable. With 40 people, it's easy to identify 2 people that are committing acts, criminal acts. With 200 people, it's harder. With 1,000 people, it's even harder. And that's where law enforcement has to, that's where you kind of have to balance your response. You have to be very, essentially, not detached, but you have to really look at it from a logical standpoint, which is what's occurring, what is the appropriate response, how do I do this? And, again, using very, very focused tactics so that I'm only applying whatever force that I need to apply to those people who are committing crimes, and yet allowing the rest of the community to express their opinions.
What are your thoughts on, this is a huge question. You could teach an entire year, I think, of university journalism on this topic. But what do you think the role of the mass media is when it comes to shaping the public's understanding of officer-involved shootings? And how has that changed, in your opinion, over, say, like the last 10 to 15 years?
Well, it's changed. Obviously it's changed dramatically, and the media obviously has the ability to really shape the narrative, which is what the media does. Essentially, they put out facts, opinions, they interview citizens, and they put out what is known to them. Now, again, the shift, and I'll talk about it from the law enforcement side. If you look back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and even internally within our own agency, the typical response to a critical event was no comment. These are open, active investigations, but with potential criminal charges, and we did not discuss the facts of a case publicly. That was kind of a standard in American law enforcement. And what you've seen change, especially over the last 5, maybe 10 years, but really more over the last 5, is the law enforcement needs to be very, very conscious of the narrative, and they need to do things to try to shape the narrative too, or to reshape the narrative once something gets out, not to control it, because it's not about controlling. The narrative is the narrative. So the story is the story. The facts are the facts. It's just the way that we present them. So the biggest shift, so one is understanding that, being aware of it. And then two is the society's demand for transparency. Society wants to know. And we also live in a society where it's a 24-hour news cycle. I want to know what happened, and I want to know what happened right now. I don't want to know what happened 6 weeks from now. I don't want to know what happened 8 months from now. I want to know what happened now. And so the response, or the struggle that law enforcement has had is how do we balance that? So how do we not taint the case? How do we not taint potential jurors down the road? How do we not rush to judgment and rush to conclusion? An officer-involved shooting is something that's going to be investigated for several months. That's just the way those investigations go. It's not a simple, hey, we're going to watch a video camera and we're going to jump to a conclusion. Officers have a right to due process. They have a right to a sleep cycle. They have a right, to be able to just like a criminal would. They have a right to make a statement, and to be able to understand kind of why they made the decisions they made. And so it's taking in all those things into account before you rush to judgment. So it's understanding kind of the instant gratification society that we live in, which is, I want to know what happened and I want to know right now.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time,
if you don't get it right now, you see it as a cover up.
Correct. And that's, again, that's a societal perception of law enforcement, which is, if we're not saying anything, it's because something wrong has happened. It's because of we're hiding information. And I don't think that's an accurate assessment.
Do you think, though, that it has happened in the past, though, and that's where that sensitivity from the public comes from? I mean, if I were to just take a critical eye to my old industry, we love to be like, politicians call us fake news, and that's why the public calls us fake news. It's not because we are fake news. And I'm like, actually, we are. We are sometimes fake news, So if we were to just take a look at ourselves and see the fact that we do perpetuate the fake news problem, and it's not just because people say something on Twitter or because Trump said it or whatever, we would probably be doing a little bit better. What do you think that police departments or law enforcement departments have always done, a perfect job at being transparent with the public when it comes to this stuff, that this wasn't maybe, where we are now is a reaction to lack of transparency? And I guess, on that vein, I know it's kind of a two-sided question. I think the press was too cozy with law enforcement for quite a while. And now I think, I'll say in a second how I think they politicized everything, but I do think that it used to be, when I first started, we would get it past the tape, if you were like rubbing shoulders with the right cop and you got all this information. But with that came kind of the unsaid, quid pro quo that you weren't going to throw a cop under the bus. And by throwing him under the bus, that would just be telling the truth about what was going on. They would take that as a personal offense. Like, what are you doing? You know, I thought we were friends. You're like, well, so yeah, I guess that's my two questions. You know, what do you think about the track record of law enforcement when it comes to transparency? Is it possible that the reaction the public has is because there wasn't, always the best or effort at that? And then also, like, what do you think about when it comes to transparency in the press? Did they play into that? You know, okay, we'll give you some time. We'll let you do this. We won't tell everybody about that. And it was almost, I don't know. I just found it to be a little bit too friendly. No pun intended, officer friendly.
No offense taken. So to speak historically, do all law enforcement agencies get it right? No. Have there been cover-ups in the past? I suspect there have. To say that we weren't transparent historically, that's probably an accurate assessment, is that we weren't. Now, again, I can name some legal reasons why, maybe, again, we had reservations about being transparent because of an active investigation. And again, that's what we used to stand on. If you look at kind of the beginning of the Ferguson events with Michael Brown, which was the initial questions were asked, hey, was there an officer involved shooting and what happened? And the initial, within the first 24 hours, it's really, we're not going to comment on that. And that is the mistake, I guess, if you want to call it that. That's where the consternation from the public comes. Society's view is you can't, that's not an appropriate answer. So again, has law enforcement been historically good at being transparent? No, we have not. To talk about kind of the media's, this perception of like the coziness between law enforcement and law enforcement. I'm not a journalist, but I can understand how that could be perceived as it, again, hey, we have a relationship, therefore now you're pushing my agenda forward. So you're doing what's right for me because of our relationship, as opposed to telling the truth. So do I think we need to be standoffish? And when I say we, I'm talking about law enforcement and the media. We don't need to be standoffish. I think we just need to be professional, which is, I think we've realized that. And when I say we, again, I think law enforcement has realized that, that is, we are essentially servants of society, servants of our communities. I take an oath, again, I kind of mentioned that earlier, but I take an oath to protect and serve my community, my state, my country. And how do I do that? And if society says, hey, your job, we pay your salary and your job is to be more transparent with us, then we have to find out a way to do a better job of that. At the same time, we do have an obligation to protect the criminal investigation, to protect officers' rights, to protect citizens' rights. And so I think we've adjusted to that. And if you can go on YouTube now and you can Google critical, videos about critical incidents. I just watched one this morning reference a shooting, I think that was in Louisiana. And it happened in February. They already have the body worn camera footage is out, and they essentially, they've released that footage, and you can kind of watch what happened that night. And so that's a huge pendulum shift in the fact that we are, that's, I guess maybe it was February 3rd when that event happened. We're February 17th. We're, 14 days away, and that information is already out there. If you go back 10 years ago, that would have never happened. So, changing American law enforcement culture is like turning that Titanic around sometimes. It's nothing happens overnight. These are gradual shifts. And I understand that some people are like, hey, they need to happen quicker. And sometimes I agree. Sometimes I think they should happen faster, but I also understand the nuances to it. And again, you're talking about multiple law enforcement agencies, multiple law enforcement cultures. And again, we can argue whether we think that's good or bad. But it's a shift in mindset. It's a shift in the way we do our business. It's a shift in societal expectations of law enforcement in general. What is it that the public expects of us? And the age old adage, as I'm a policeman, I know better than you. You haven't walked a mile in my shoes. You can't tell me how to do my job. Well, there's a little bit hint of truth to that, which is you haven't walked a mile in my shoes, so you don't necessarily understand what it is that I do. But at the same time, again, we should be responsive to society's expectations. We should be more in tune with that, as servants of the community. If that's their expectation of us, we should be able to help answer those questions and provide that information.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, again, I would ask the public and society to understand is that there's certain things that we can talk about and there's certain things that we can't talk about. But when we can, we should. And I think we've gotten better. If you look at our media relations people, again, and I'll speak regionally, if you look at the PIOs kind of in the Midwest regionally, they're much more in tune with that, much more attentive to those requests. And I think that we do try to accommodate when we can.
Okay, going to what I was going to ask about regarding the press and politicization of law enforcement, I have found it to be really interesting over the, I would say, last few years, that it seems like if you're politically left, and I'm not, I want to say more like kind of if you fit into these categories, into the two-party categories. So I don't think that really very well encapsulates what's happening politically in our country, but I'm just going to play that game for a second because of who's watching mainstream media. Okay. So my audience tends to not be a mainstream media viewer. I have people that you would consider left anarchist and people who would be a right-wing extremist per, the Atlantic or something. Right. So I have all kinds of folks who would be sort of outside of those political categories, but I'm going to play the traditional political category for a second. What I notice is that if you're sort of a left of center Democrat, you tend to be highly skeptical of local law enforcement, but you are all about federal law enforcement doing whatever they need to protect democracy, surveil you online, do whatever they need. If you're right, you are skeptical of the feds and they're taking away your rights, but you're less likely to be skeptical of police locally. One of my theories on that is the media that is consumed pushes, I think, those messages differently for the audience itself. I think people who watch CNN are getting a large dose, or MSNBC or whatever, large dose of the big government, federal government is here to protect us. We have this undercurrent of anti-democratic extremists in the country that we all need to be scared of. It's definitely Joe Smith on Twitter who's going to take over the country, not us in Congress and our efforts to defy the Constitution. It's that guy. So that's where they keep thinking, and their focus is then put on the corruption in local law enforcement, or that they're perceived corruption, or whatever you feel that it is. And then on the other side, it's like you're fed this dose of the federal government. And honestly, like, because of the people that I cover, I don't think this is incorrect. I think I've had a constitutional attorney on who was arrested and her constitutional rights were violated by local law enforcement. I see the different breakdown on who you distrust. And so I know that's gotta be in part the media's fault. Like, who's your bad guy, and why is it that it seems like most people with this political affiliation see that federal arm as the bad guy, and these people over here see the local as the bad guy? How does that work? And I'm just curious what you think about that, because if you take a look at it, it does kind of seem like law enforcement is now losing on both sides. You used to sort of have maybe a conservative contingency that was like back the blue no matter who. I think you're losing that, and I think people are concerned. Like, there's somebody here in the chat who is saying, I swear to uphold the Constitution, but will follow orders that break that oath and your rights. And I do think people are concerned about cops doing that now. I don't see people saying that anymore in the chat. I used to see that years ago. I don't see any more people saying that. I see them say, now I take each cop individually. I'm not going to just say back the blue no matter who. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, you're right. That's a it's a big topic, but I think you have a general distrust that's kind of a feeling that you have in society. And then again, depending on where you fall politically, kind of where your mind is, the distrust is either focused kind of at big government, or the distrust is focused at local law enforcement or local government. And you have this general feeling of mistrust, depending on where you are, like you said, depending on where you fall in that. It is a struggle. In law enforcement, essentially, sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes we get stuck in the middle. My job, again, do I have personal opinions about certain laws? Absolutely, I do. Unfortunately, I get played, and I say I, and I'll use my, again, like me as the example. Do my job is to uphold the law. I don't write the law. I uphold it. So let's talk. I mean, medical marijuana or recreational marijuana is a big topic, and we'll use that one because it's easy. But again, I have personal feelings about that. But again, that doesn't matter. When I come to work and I put this uniform on, my job is to uphold the law that's been passed. Now, again, I may agree with it or disagree with it, but that's not really my decision. That's how chaos begins to be created, which is, again, now everybody is interpreting it separately, and now I'm making independent decisions based on my own personal opinion. And again, so I think the media sometimes plays that, which is look at what law enforcement is doing. Another good example is if you look at during the COVID vaccine and the mask mandates, and you would see, I watched a video of a woman get arrested at an outdoor park because she wouldn't put a mask on, do I feel like she should have been arrested? Probably not. Do I think that, again, being in law enforcement, do I understand that officer was put in a very, very difficult position, which was the whatever municipality, local government said that was the law, and then he was called upon to enforce it, whether he agreed with it or not. He or she agreed with that ordinance or that law, and essentially you're kind of stuck in the middle sometimes. And then the media then will portray that for whatever agenda or for whatever messaging they're trying to purvey. And so I think sometimes we get stuck or we get used a little bit as a pawn, maybe in a bigger context, which is, now again, if the message is we're anti-government, and I can take a clip or a video of an officer doing something, and I can use that to propel or to reinforce the messaging that I'm trying to send. Again, that's unfortunate. It's a very difficult position for law enforcement to be in. I ask citizens, and again, when I talk to my family members and I talk to people in the community here, which is, again, like people, St. Louis, Missouri is a good example. Missouri just passed recreational marijuana. So it just went into effect this month, really. Again, whether I agree with it or not personally, that has really no bearing on whether I think people should be able to use marijuana products. The reality is they can now. It's legal, so now we again, that's what it is. So to answer your question or to kind of speak on that, yeah, I think there's a general distrust. Again, does the media do that for headlines? Again, is there again, if you go to conspiracy theory and you talk kind of, like global picture, hey, there's people that are influencing global politics or national politics. Do they take clips? Do they take these little incidents and do they use them to kind of push their agenda? Absolutely. I think that's true. I'm a big believer in that. I think most men and women in law enforcement, they get up, they put their pants on, they go to work because they're just like every other citizen in the United States, where hey, I'm trying to make a living. I'm trying to make my life better for me and my children. And I don't think law enforcement in general, again, if there's a perception out here that we do, I think it's wrong. But this perception that we come to work with a hidden agenda, we're just like the plumbers, we're just like the traffic workers, we're just like everybody else, the electricians, construction guys. We're coming to work to do a job. Again, and most officers, again, I think they do the best they can with the parameters that are given to them and kind of the ordinances and laws that are imposed by their local governments. And it's a difficult balance. It really is.
I think I would agree with you that most people working in any field are sleeping fine at night, thinking they did the best they could. I just think in certain professions like yours and my old profession that there's just a lot more at stake when it comes to just being just an average person trying to do a job, right? Because when you're in the media, same thing, right? And people also think that the vast majority of people in the mass media are trying to brainwash the country when they're not even like awake enough to do that, right? They're just
Right.
repeating
Right.
a lot of the same propaganda that everybody else is subject to. I don't think that makes it right, but it does help you understand, I guess, if you're going to go after it and try to fix the situation, it would be best to understand the problem in order to find a valid solution. If you think that everybody coming to a newsroom is a sinister underlord who has this double agenda happening, then that's going to be a different solution versus somebody who's just like a robot going through the motions, hasn't been given the time to understand what they're talking about, hasn't been given the opportunity to ask questions, in some cases by management is told to stay quiet, or sort of you learn over time this sort of self-censorship tactics because you're like, oh, I'm not going to bring that up because I know that's not really a friendly topic in this newsroom, stuff like that. I always say, like, if the person who's helping me check out at the grocery store is like me when it comes to these, exactly what you're talking about, these fallible human characteristics, then it's not that big of a deal, because what's the worst thing that happens? Every once in a while I pay an extra $5 because they take one of my apples or something and stick it in. It's not a big deal. But when somebody in your profession does something, it could be really bad, or my profession, it could create a situation like a whole community could be up in arms, right? After something that we report, just because we're not paying attention, or we're just human, sorry, we're just human. Like, it is, I agree with you that I do think it's a lot more mundane than most people think. However, I also think that can be more dangerous, given the circumstances,
Well, no. You're 100% right. The majority of law enforcement work is mundane, boring, kind of run of the mill. It's average work at best. Again, I would encourage citizens go do a ride along with an officer in your local jurisdiction and see what it is that officer does on a daily basis. The one nuance to it, and you kind of alluded to that, which is the potential implication for something catastrophic to happen. As a law enforcement officer, you're asked to make very, very, I guess, important decisions. You're asked to make critical decisions very, very quickly. And the reality is sometimes if those decisions are wrong, they have catastrophic consequences. So again, you think about the decision to use lethal force. That's a decision that officers make in split seconds. And if it's a bad decision, there is a serious consequence to that. And so it is, and I think law enforcement is much more cognizant of that. I don't know. Again, most officers that you start the academy where day one they give you a bulletproof vest and they give you a firearm. Or when you graduate, you actually don't get that on day one, but when you come out of the academy and you're now licensed by whatever licensing agency that for that state or that jurisdiction licenses you, that should be something that we really, really reinforce, which is like, we're going to ask you now to make decisions. Most of them are going to be boring and innocuous. They aren't going to be big decisions. Do you write a speeding ticket? Do you not write a speeding ticket? How do you make an arrest? Do you not make arrest? The bigger decisions, when these critical incidents, when you go to something and you have to make a split-second decision about using lethal force, again, if you're wrong, the consequence to that is essentially catastrophic, not only for the officer, but for the citizen that's involved or the suspect that's involved, for their family members. And it is, people, there a spotlight on law enforcement and kind of the decision making that goes on in law enforcement? Absolutely. There's no question there is, probably more so of a spotlight now than there ever has been, which is making sure that we get it right. And that's a lot of pressure. Although I don't know if it's unrealistic. There should be an expectation is that when we do things, we get them right. The only balance with that is I would ask that people understand that we're human, and that we're fallible creatures and we make mistakes. But I am intimately aware of the fact that sometimes those mistakes can have catastrophic events, and can have consequences to that. So understanding that, accepting it. I think if you look at recruiting and retention now in American law enforcement, there's a huge struggle right now. If you, again, read any headline across the nation about trying to recruit officers or people to come into this profession, it is definitely slowed down. And there's a struggle to recruit law enforcement personnel. And that's part of that is because the expectation and that pressure is so high. Although I don't know if I would argue that it's unrealistic or even wrong. And there should be an expectation that is that if we're going to do it, we do it right. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, no, I mean, it makes me think of how a lot of journalists, I think, go through their day-to-day action without understanding that it may just be your story today, but it's somebody's life in a lot of cases that you're going to leave behind and move on to something else tomorrow. And I don't think that if we really held in tension the effects that we have,
well, I think I lost you there for a second.
I'm back.
All right,
Did I freeze?
got you back. Yep.
Okay, I told you that could happen, right?
You did. You warned me.
Anyway, I don't know what I missed, but I was just saying that basically we just don't take seriously enough the effects that our work has. And I think if we did, we wouldn't have the system we do in mainstream media, which is basically factory farmed information where you just churn out stuff as fast as possible. I think that reflects the fact that we don't take seriously enough the consequences of our actions. If we did, we wouldn't be putting journalists in a position where they, even if they're very well-meaning people, they are set up to fail because they simply cannot understand the complexity of certain topics in 2 hours. And you can't even report that in 90 seconds. That's insane. The average TV reporter has to keep their story to 90 seconds. I remember days where my story was 1 minute and 33 seconds, and my boss still said I had to cut 3 seconds, which usually meant an entire soundbite, which was probably, one half of what somebody said that I was even allowed to put in there, right? So they probably got 2 sound bites, and I had to trim 1 just to get 3 seconds off the top. It's just insane. So I think if we really believed in what we do, if we really believed in journalism, if we really thought that was what we were doing, and we understood the consequences of our behavior, we would not have a system like that. But to me, the fact that we do reflects the fact that I actually think deep down, maybe we understand that what we're doing is something a little bit different. We're just selling information for profit. I'm not really quite sure, but okay. I know you're going to have to go soon, so I want to throw a couple more questions your way from AllisonMorrow.locals.com. And since you were talking about recruiting, I'll skip to Gregory real fast. How many officers have left the department to pursue a job in a different vocation, or to join a different police department, or just retired since the Floyd riots? How has that affected the St. Louis County PD?
So, yes, I apologize if you can hear the fire truck going by outside. But it's been significant. So we've seen you've definitely seen an uptick in kind of a change in vocation. So, we are commissioned. So, and again, I'll speak for my own agency, St. Louis County Police Department. Prior to kind of the Ferguson, 2014, 2015, 2016 era, we were running at over 900 commissioned police officers. And that number is down dramatically, probably by 10% at least. You kind of saw, in 2004, at post 2014, post Ferguson, you kind of saw an immediate impact, which was officers leaving, saying, "Hey, this isn't for me. This isn't what I signed up to do." For some obvious reasons, and then there's always a little bit of natural turnover and transition. And then you rolled into the George Floyd riots. We had some other, there was a trial here involving a local, a St. Louis City police officer, Jason Stockley. And so St. Louis, obviously, it has impacted us. And I can tell you, again, from talking to some of my peers and talking to counterparts across the country, it has. I would say the applications are down at least by 50%. So just the number of applicants applying is down significantly. And then you compound that with kind of a defund the police movement. And again, not necessarily that that's true. Again, that's a headline, so it's a buzzword. But you've seen kind of local governments shifting resources. So are there different ways that we can fund other programs? Unfortunately, law enforcement kind of became the catch-all. And for the last 15, 20 years, law enforcement was the catch-all. Now you see more of a focus on a different response. So response to those people that are in mental health crisis. Is that really a law enforcement response? And does it need to be? And so you see governments and with budgets and things like that being shifted to other programs. And again, it becomes a headline and it becomes a politicized issue. There is I would argue there is a place for law enforcement in our society, and now we just need to define kind of what that is. To answer his question specifically, it's been dramatic. We struggle to retain within our own agency. We've gone to 12-hour shifts, and that's based on the staffing need. It's not because we think 12-hour shifts is better for our officers. It's just because in order for us to staff appropriately, we have to really kind of maximize our manpower. And so, yeah, it's unfortunately it's hit us pretty hard.
This was an interesting follow-up question from Officer Blue Gun. With the number of applicants down and agencies lowering standards, do you think that's true? First off, because that's what this person's saying, but I don't know if you agree. Does Commander Lohr think that will lead to more incidents like Tyree Nichols?
I think the lowering of standards does, absolutely. Now, have agencies lowered standards? Probably. Again, I can't speak to other agencies and kind of the standards that they hold. I think, and again, I'll speak for my own agency. Yes, we cast a wider net. So things that when I was hired, in the early 2000s, if I had a felony conviction on my record, I would not have been hired. That would have been an automatic disqualifier. And I don't think that's the case now. And again, I would encourage people to go out and do your own research, find out your local jurisdiction. What are the requirements to being a police officer? Do they allow felony convictions? And then if they do, what is that felony conviction for? If it's for a property crime, maybe they overlook it. If it's for a violent crime, hopefully they don't. But again, go out and kind of do your own research on what your own agency is doing. Yes, anytime that you lower the standard, yeah, do you have potential for bringing in bad apples? Absolutely. And again, in the world we live in, you've got 5 officers in Memphis now that give every man and woman that puts a uniform on a black eye. Again, now I'm blamed for something that I had absolutely no control over. I say that not meaning any ill will or ill intent toward anybody, but unfortunately, the reality is I now have to fight that stigma of, hey, you're part of that collective group, and that's what your group is doing or condoning. And I can tell you, again, personally, absolutely not. That's unacceptable behavior, and it should be dealt with appropriately, which I think it is. I think, again, if you look at the response, kind of look at the reaction to the events in Memphis, Tennessee, it was swift. That's probably the fastest it's ever moved, which is those officers were instantly fired, and now they're being charged, and the process is working the way it should.
Well, okay, let me butt in because I want to play devil's advocate on that one, and not because I necessarily have an opinion one way or the other about the Tyree Nichols situation specifically, but if I were to put myself in the position, I'm always looking at like where the power dynamic is. And so do you think that firing officers like right away before an investigation is the right way to do it? Because to me, it seems like, that seems a little concerning for me. Like if you haven't done a thorough investigation yet and you just fire cops, like what, explain that to me, because it's
no. There is some behavior that is completely unacceptable, and that you would be terminated from any job. I am a huge believer in due rights and due process, which means that as an employee of whatever agency you work for, you should have due process. I'm in alignment with you when you're playing devil's advocate, which is now we're not pandering to public opinion, so we're not pandering to a headline. So hey, as a mayor or as a county executive, let's fire these officers within 24 hours because I think that'll help calm the public, or that'll make it easier for us as we go forward. I do believe officers have every right to due process. They should have the ability, just like a criminal, to defend themselves, to make their statements, to have legal representation. But on the other hand, there are certain occasions when the behavior is just so egregious that I hate to say those are softballs, but again, there are certain things that I know if I go out and do tomorrow that I'm going to get fired for, and that's just again, that to me, it's I hate to say common sense, but if I go out and I do that, I use excessive force and I beat a man for really, it's an inappropriate or an excessive use of force, I would anticipate that I'm going to be fired for that. Now, and then the criminal component of it will take place. It's kind of what you see happening in Memphis, which is they were instantly fired for their agency because of the behavior, and now the criminal process will take place. Now, whether they're found guilty, whether they go to prison, that's for the criminal process to play out. But I would agree with you. Is I don't think we should fire a policeman just because it looks bad, or just because public opinion says that's wrong.
It just seems to me, I'm sorry to go down another rabbit hole because I know we got a few more questions from locals I want to ask you, but this is a really interesting topic for me because more and more I see these police chiefs or mayors just, it feels like they put their cops in a position to fail. They don't have the training, they have bad laws or whatever else. And then something goes wrong and they're like, see this bad cop. And it bothers me because my husband was in the military and I see similar things in the military. Don't get me started, with where they send these people off to these different countries thinking that they're going to, protect, Americans from all these terrible things. And in many cases, there's nefarious intent, I think, from leadership. And even when they're there, the way that the veterans, these military people that are currently serving, if it just feels like they're set up to do this dirty work, and then the people in leadership are like, "You're fired," or how could you do that? And it's like, well, wait a second, how could they not have done that? I mean, it just seems like it would be the natural consequence of the situation you set up, and so I just, this whole idea of let's just fire the cops, listen, don't get me wrong, I understand that perspective too. But also I look at the leadership and I'm like, that to me seems like very convenient for you all, to just say it's just like the individual cop's problem and not a situation that I think could have some serious, if they were to actually take inventory of the municipality itself, the way the government is run, the cop is just it's almost like the symptom of the disease, I guess, if you will.
No, I think your point, I think you kind of danced around it, but you're hitting the nail on the head, which is it all comes down to leadership, which is true leaders understand that you understand what you're asking your people, those subordinates, to do. So understand what it is that you're asking them to do. Do not be so disconnected from the job that you're asking them to, or the task that you're asking them to complete. And true leadership is standing up for what's right. So true leadership is not taking the path of least resistance, not taking a path of convenience. But understand, as good leaders will take heat for their people. So understand that, that as a good leader, I have to provide the proper training. I have to provide the proper equipment. I have to be cognizant of the culture of the organization. So what is it, again, so, we have a general order book. No, that's it. I mean, it's got to be 10 pages thick. Do I understand what's in that general order book? Absolutely, I do. But understand, just because it says that, is that what it's pattern in practice? Is that what we're actually doing on the street? So we say that we're going to, we've taken an oath and we've sworn to uphold the public, and we're going to treat people in a professional, respectful manner. But if that's not what we're doing as a leader, I have to recognize that, because ultimately you're right, which is I'm essentially setting someone up for failure, and that's not fair. And so it really is, to me, it's a leadership issue, which is understand what your organization is, understand what they really are doing out there, not what you think they're doing, but what are they really doing? And then are you comfortable with that? Because if you're not, then you need to change it before something catastrophic happens, or else you're going to get put in that position, which is you're going to take that path of least resistance. You're going to say, well, again, it's the ostrich with his head in the sand. I didn't know that was happening. Well, you should, as a true leader, you should understand what's going on in the organization. And if you need to make organizational change, then that's incumbent upon the leader to do that. At the same time, it's incumbent upon the leader to stand up for your people, and not use them as scapegoats, not use them as the easy button. And again, that's now we get back to that kind of there are 18,000 police agencies out there with 18,000 different police chiefs, and Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger, but it doesn't really matter. Of all of that leadership, you have to be in touch with what your people are doing. And then if you need to make a change, then change it.
Okay. Going back to the beginning when we were discussing your decision not to wear riot gear and when you were named officer friendly, Don's wife asks, I'm glad his tactic worked. What was his backup plan if it didn't work? And I'm guessing that refers to the fact that when you were doing that, 2 officers had just been shot. This is post Michael Brown shooting. Then there's protests, and then 2 cops are shot, and these protests continue. And then you don't wear riot gear, and your intention, you can re-explain if you would like to for why you decided to do that. But Don's wife was asking, like, okay, great, de-escalating, trying to mirror the public. We don't need to wear riot gear. It just makes things, maybe makes people more hysterical about what's going on and hates us more, and we're trying to have a conversation, whatever. Please re-explain your intent. I don't want to get it wrong. But what if it didn't work? What if here you are now, the crowd turns on you and you're not wearing the protective gear that would help you? I think that's what she's asking, if I understand correctly.
Well, no, I understand, but if it didn't work, we would have adjusted. If it got to the point where I didn't feel like I was safe, now, granted, I wear body armor. And I do as a commander. I to this day I still wear it. That's a deal I have with my wife when I first came to law enforcement. Is that I would always wear my body armor, even if I'm in an office setting. I still wear it. And if it didn't work, I probably would not have put myself in that position. So, and that, again, that's a hard, there is an inherent risk in law enforcement. And again, I think, again, as a law enforcement officer, you have to kind of understand that there is some danger associated with it. It doesn't mean that we take unnecessary risks. It doesn't mean that we're naive to kind of the danger that's out there, but there has to be a balance. So you can't overreact to one incident. So again, it kind of goes back to that kind of philosophy, which is, if you've got 50 people protesting or 40 people outside, and there's, and 39 of them are out there exercising their constitutional right, and you have one bad apple in that group, that doesn't mean that you treat the other 39 inappropriately or that you take away their rights. And that's the balancing act here. That's kind of that where you kind of have to walk that line, which is, if it doesn't work, then we adjust. Again, trust me, I'm not invincible. I'm not bulletproof. I never thought I was. Now, granted, when I walked out in front of the crowd, I also knew that I had numerous officers behind me that would come out to my rescue if I needed it. So if I would have gotten sucker punched in the crowd, I also knew that. I mean, if you look at the picture of the headline there's officers that are standing right behind me, and then what you can't see is probably the 200 officers that are back at the staging area that are 100 yards behind me that are all geared up, ready to go. So again, as the crowd, if the tactic doesn't work, that's our job to adjust to it. Again, and if you do the history kind of on the officers that were shot, Scott Brown and Colin McKay were the 2 officers that were shot. And if you kind of know that the situation there, it would help explain it a little bit better. It was kind of a one-off. Obviously there was a lot of gunfire. If you go back and I can play you videos from Ferguson of the amount of gunfire, if you look at the entirety of the Ferguson kind of civil disturbance era, there was no law enforcement never once used deadly force, which is a compliment. And it's a huge, I guess it's a badge that we kind of wear, a badge of honor, which is that we were able to kind of make it through that without having to employ lethal force at any time, which shows not great restraint, but it just shows the appropriate use of force that was employed during those times. So tactics are something that are kind of constantly evolving, and that's, again, that I was comfortable with it. Not everybody would have been. Not everybody is. I understand that too. But I think, to me, again, I'll speak for myself personally. I thought it was the appropriate response in that time, which was to help kind of bring things down a little bit and help at least allow people to have a name and a face that they could come talk to, versus just a nameless group of officers that are all wearing helmets and shields, and that they didn't have a connection to, because ultimately it's about community, and I'm a member of this community just like everyone else is, and I have a vested interest in making sure my community is safe. And that, I guess that's kind of the tactic or the mindset that I went through, which is, as a member of this community, I want to be able to have these conversations. We should be able to have some dialogue. And if we can't do that, we're just spinning our wheels. We're not really making any progress or getting anywhere.
This question from Brisbane, I think you already kind of answered it, but Lieutenant, assuming you knew that the riots were based on a lie, why would you ask your officers to be fish in a barrel? What confidence did the troops have in you after that? Let me expand that for a second, because I think you already answered number one, that LA Times got it wrong. You didn't ask the other officers to dress like you, but also I think we kind of touched a little bit too on. I asked the question of how does the reality of the situation versus the perceived situation determine your response? In other words, if you have people who are just very upset, but they're very upset based on a skewed perception of what happened based on media's reporting of it, how does that change your response? I guess because in other words, if I smack you across the face and I oh man, you know what? I probably shouldn't have done that. So I'm going to go meet him for coffee and tell him I'm sorry that I smacked him across the face. But if I didn't smack you across the face, but you were just pissed because you read on the news that I smacked you across the face, and you're like, she smacked me across the face. I don't know. I might go, you know what? I don't know if I'm going to go talk to him about it, because he didn't, he doesn't understand what really happened. I didn't smack him across the face. I'm just curious, like, how does the perceived reality versus the actual reality of what happened affect your decision making for how to address these situations when you have protests or riots like this?
Well, and it's difficult. So if you think back to kind of the Ferguson, I had, and again, I'll speak for myself. So I had done some like riot control, if you want to call it that, protester crowd control type stuff prior to that. The difference with this one is that we were the focus of the protest. So law enforcement itself was the focus of the protest. If you go back to 2010, you go back to 2007, you had the World Economic Forum, you had some of these the agricultural kind of protests, Monsanto, genetically modified foods, those protests. So law enforcement would come into those protests, and we were essentially separating two parties. We tried to remain neutral, essentially, just to kind of maintain peace and order. This protest was different, which is we were now the focus of the protest. That does not absolve us of our obligation to the community, and that is difficult. So, I think to the commenter's point, which was, how do you put, why would you subject your officers? You're like putting, fish into a barrel, and that is very, very difficult. And again, I'm the first one to admit our tactics on the front end were not very good. And again, there is a balancing act, which is our obligation to preserve law and order and to protect property and protect life. We have an obligation to do that, even when the focus of the protest is the way that we're doing it. And so again, from a tactic standpoint, again, providing officers with cover. So, and trying to keep them out of a skirmish line. Skirmish lines are not ideal. That is essentially putting fish in a barrel. But there are certain times that you just kind of have to do that. But you try to minimize that. And then when you do it, are we providing those officers with protection? Are we providing force protection? So do I have people out there that are ready to react immediately to a lethal encounter or to a potentially life-ending threat? Then yes, we do. But again, at the end of the day, we have an obligation to protect our community and to provide that security for the public, to provide that security for the people that are actually out doing it peacefully, that are there to exercise their constitutional rights. And it's difficult, and that's where the balancing act comes in. That's where it's easy to kind of pick a side, and say that's terrible and you should never do that. If we didn't show up at all, so if law enforcement wouldn't have shown up at all, again, how many businesses get broken into, how many cars get set on fire, how many storefront windows get broken, because some people in that group are now committing criminal acts. So we still have an obligation to protect those that are part of the community, even the ones that are upset or angry or frustrated with the way that we're doing that. And so it's as a commander, as a supervisor, it is a balancing act, which is, balancing the need to protect our community and balancing the need to protect our officers. And that's a very, very, it's a tight line. It's a tightrope act to try to accomplish both at the same time and not overreact one way or another, which is underreact, which is we do nothing and we just walk away, versus overreact, which is everybody comes out in full riot gear and we start launching chemical munitions.
Okay, Charles's question has to do with cops who don't seem to understand the Constitution and arrest people based on orders that they got that violate people's rights. And this person says that, my wife was very well trained, but these guys scare me because they seem to use their power against people, which is the antithesis of American policing. What do you think? I mean, it's a big question, but I do think we kind of talked about it a little earlier. It's very concerning for people that, especially the last couple of years, you brought up masks, like arresting people for not wearing masks. And like I said, I had this constitutional attorney on who was arrested. She's suing. Her charges were dropped. They apologized, but it's like after all this crap that she's been through, and she has the ability to sue. What about people who can't? It just seems like a crappy situation. So that's the question. I think a lot of people get concerned that cops are just like robots. They'll be the first ones to take your guns away if the government wants to take your guns away. If they enact terrible public health policy, which will later be found to be unconstitutional, who cares? Cops are going to enforce that too. I'm just curious if you want to expound on those thoughts at all before we wrap.
No, it is again, I kind of alluded to this earlier. Unfortunately, we kind of get used as a pawn in some of these political debates. And it's a tough position. I feel bad for that gentleman whose wife, again, I'm sure she's well trained. Hopefully she understands the constitutional law. I would hope that every law enforcement officer understands the Constitution, because that's the oath that you take when you swear your oath of office, is that you're going to uphold and protect the Constitution. At some point, again, that's where society has to get more involved. That again, you allow your local jurisdiction to pass. And again, I understand it's easier said than done, and I don't like making generalized statements, but get involved. Go and talk to your county, to your county councils. Go and talk to your city, city aldermen, whatever kind of local authority you have. And again, make sure that you're pushing back against some of those things. I'll use a kind of an example. We're obviously right along the border with Illinois, and I think Governor Pritzker is trying to pass some legislation, or has passed some legislation reference firearms. And you've seen I think it was 42, there were over 40 of the sheriffs that said that they wouldn't enforce it. And so you do see some pushback on that. Again, that means that you're taking a stand, and that's difficult. I would encourage everybody, again, this is one of my favorite sayings, right is right and wrong is wrong. And so at some point you kind of have to stand up for what's right. Again, I'm not a hey, everybody does what they think, again, what they think they should do. But again, if you understand the law, and then you can kind of apply that in a common sense kind of way, which is, let's use some common sense here. Let's not try to exacerbate problems. Let's look at everything on a case by case basis. So, it's unfortunate, but a law enforcement is used in that situation, we're used as kind of a political pawn. And that's not fair to us. It puts officers in bad positions, and it creates these situations where, it brings negative attention to law enforcement in general. And that's unfortunate. Like I said, it's not fair.
Okay. We got 6 minutes before your heart out. So I'm going to try to get
All right.
three more questions to throw your way. So let's see if we can get to them. What could be done to encourage a neighborhood who distrust the police to send their sons and daughters into service in order to provide quality policing?
So the first thing I would tell you is to go to your local police department and try to see if they have a program where you can either ride along or you can make a relationship. I don't expect people to blindly trust anything. And I understand, especially in today's world, that blind trust just probably is not there. So it's a process. Go and meet some of the officers, ask them their thoughts on law enforcement in general, ask them their thoughts on community policing. What is their expectation of the community? And then by all means, hopefully they should say, well, what is your expectation of us? And by kind of building that relationship, it's either going to give them more comfort, or it's going to reinforce kind of a whatever perception or negative perception they may have. But that's probably the first step, which is don't believe a headline, go and build those relationships. That would be the first step.
Okay. My question is, why would anyone want to join the police force today?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer that. It is an extremely rewarding career. I went to college. I have a degree. I got my degree in economics. I thought I would be a financial planner. I realized very quickly that, or a CPA. I was going to be a CPA, but I realized very quickly that I didn't like sitting behind a desk. And this profession allowed me to get out and be a part of my community and really give back. And there is kind of a servant attitude that comes in law enforcement, which is understanding, like, when you do this, it is selfless and it is a sacrifice to give back and to help people. And that's kind of the common denominator you see amongst most law enforcement, which is this selfless characteristic. And so it is extremely rewarding. It can be very frustrating too. It can be disappointing. It can be heartbreaking. It can be pressure filled. It's exciting. At the same time, again, it is challenging. There's no question. But if you're looking for a challenge, you're looking for a way to really give back to your community, again, make a change. The biggest thing in our country, if you don't like the way something is, then go do something about it. Don't accept it. So if you don't like the way things are going, then anybody can sit on the sidelines and throw stones. Anybody can sit on the sidelines and say this is terrible. The reality is that if you don't like it, then do something about it. You're probably not going to change everything. You're not going to fix the world's problems. We're not going to fix all the problems we have in the United States overnight, but at the same time, you can do your part. And if everybody does their part, then we tend to collectively make things better. So it's still a rewarding profession. It really is. There's still a lot more positives than there are negatives. We just tend to focus on the negatives right now.
In your opinion, what percentage of protests were organic and genuine, mourning the community, as opposed to outside agitation from the likes of Al Sharpton and his ilk? And I mean, and not just maybe necessarily with Ferguson, but generally speaking, what do you think about that? Agent provocateurs, I guess. Everybody thinks, I want to say everybody, but a lot of people that I hear from range in opinion on these. Like, it's just generally uneducated people just pissed as all hell. Like, that's one view. Or it's people that know what's going on and are rightfully angry and burning things down because it's the only option that they have now. And I think that gets stoked by politicians too. And then there's the other part that's like, no, this is the government coming in to instigate situations. Like, it's all the way up to these potentially three-letter agencies. People have a wide range of opinions on this. I will just say, from my opinion, in Seattle, 100% there were paid positions to protest and organize. In fact, I have a very good friend who, we disagree on a lot of stuff, but she's a professional organizer. I mean, that's literally what she does. She organizes protests. And so that it's definitely happening. They do pay people to come and do that stuff. It's an interesting job to have, but anyway, I'm not her babysitter. So anyway, right. So yeah. So I'm just curious, how much of, in your experience, is it like organic, or how much is it, sort of set up to have a particular level of conflict?
I think almost all of these start organically. So you have an incident that takes place, pick your city, you have an incident that takes place and you have an instant organic reaction. And then unfortunately what you have is then people then try to capitalize on that. We saw it during Ferguson, the 24, 48 hours, the reaction is a local reaction. That's a frustration that's coming out from the people that live here and that are part of this community. Within 4 to 5 days, then you start to see the organizers coming in. You start to see people now capitalizing on that opportunity. And so to answer the question, I think the majority of them are probably organic. They start organically, which is again, that's a community reaction to an event. And then unfortunately you have people that just want to take advantage of it.
Okay, can I ask you one more question?
Yeah, go.
Stoop Dog is asking about requiring all police to have at least a bachelor's degree. I think it would weed out a lot of riffraff. Can I give you my personal opinion? I think this overestimates the value of a college education. I think I've met a lot of dumb people in college and a lot of brainwashed people in college. I don't think this necessarily gets you what people think it's going to get you by getting a 4-year degree in college. I don't know what you think about that, but I've heard my husband talk about this because he's going to college right now, finally using his GI Bill at 40. And that's one of the questions that comes up a lot, having a 4-year degree as a requirement for cops. And we had a conversation about it. And I just don't, I don't have such high esteem anymore for the university system to think that that's going to fix some problems we've talked about.
No, I think the point that he's probably trying to make, and I won't obviously, to me, education is good. Education is important. Understanding the way the process works, being an educated person helps you make better decisions. But we have different pathways for recruitment, different pathways to get into law enforcement. One of them is, one prerequisite is to have a bachelor's degree, but there are other pathways. Prior military service is another path for application within the department. So I think that's probably narrowing it too much. I mean, some of the best policemen that I've ever worked with didn't have degrees. They were prior military, or they just had good street smarts because they grew up in a rough neighborhood. So they grew up kind of surrounded by that. I grew up in a relatively bland, I grew up in small town Ohio. I went to high school, really not exposed to kind of a big city. And that actually was probably a disadvantage to me, coming into a profession where, understanding, kind of criminal behavior, which I hadn't been exposed to as a kid or even in college. I just wasn't exposed to that kind of behavior. So I think the education, his point about education is important, which is being educated, having life experience. Again, if somebody can tell me, a test or a process, how do I pick good decision makers? Because to me, like, common sense and decision making is what makes good policemen. So, character is important to me. Decision making is important to me. Communication is important to me. And I don't equate those things to having a bachelor's degree. You can be very, very book smart and have a bachelor's degree. That doesn't mean that you have character. It doesn't mean that you make good decisions, and it doesn't mean that you can communicate. And so those, again, I'm looking for, and I'm, again, speaking for me, I'm looking for certain characteristics in our applicants. And again, now where you get those, I'm not as concerned. I don't think it translates to a bachelor's degree to those characteristics. It may, you may have a bachelor's degree and have great character and have a great work ethic and be a good decision maker, but I don't think having that degree equates to those things.
Okay. There is, well, thanks, Lynn, for the super chat. Thanks for coming on, Jerry. And thank you, everyone, for supporting the channel. Like, subscribe, and share. Yes, please do that. I know we had some rowdy conversation in the chat. I always appreciate it, actually. I appreciate everybody's different perspectives. I'm glad that I have an audience that disagrees on stuff instead of just everybody of the same mindset. I think it actually means that we're doing something right here. There was, Jerry, one question. You got to go. You don't have to answer it, but I figured I'd throw it this if you do. How does the shooting of officers change the police force culture? I had a friend 10 days on the force, shot dead at a traffic stop.
Well, it makes it hard to do your job. It obviously it's, it's a tragedy. The loss of any life, to me, all life is precious, period. So any loss of life to me is a tragedy. Yeah, it makes our profession harder. I mean, there's no answer for that, which is, how does that impact law enforcement? Well, it makes it more difficult. Does it tend to make officers more defensive and more kind of standoffish? Sure it does, which is, there's an inherent danger of this job. And if you think that everybody's out to kill you, are you going to treat people differently? Absolutely. And so again, it's a balancing act. And I keep kind of going back to that, but it is a balance. It's the ability to treat people fairly, to be respectful, to uphold the law, to communicate, to be able to disagree respectfully, and at the same time be able to protect yourself. And that's where you have to be able to balance those things. Again, if I'm a robot and I think everybody is out to kill me, does that mean I'm going to treat people differently? Absolutely. It means I'm going to treat people as if they're all the enemy. And the reality is they're not the enemy. They're part of my community. And that's where essentially you got to be able to kind of turn it on and turn it off, which is, General Mad Dog Mattis, I think, had a quote, which is, be polite, be respectful, but be prepared to kill everyone you meet. And there's a certain kind of probably truth to that, which is be polite, be respectful, do the right thing, but also be prepared to defend yourself. I mean, that's just a part of the job. And it's unfortunate. I wish we lived in a society where, people wouldn't do things like that, but they just do. So you kind of have to be prepared for that. But at the same time, you have to kind of regulate that. You can't be hyper alert, hyper aware, hyper defensive all the time, which is, you can't treat people. Again, we're not an occupying force. You can't treat people like they're the enemy. So, and if you kind of go into it with that mindset, then typically you're able to kind of do your job and do it well.